It might feel like this is a particularly vulnerable or negative share in doing this podcast episode, but I want to reassure you it's not. And I'll explain more when we dive into the episode. But this is 3 times where my ego sabotaged my business results. And it's very clear to me that it was my ego that was the sabotage, and I thought it would be helpful and insightful to share it with you. So that's what I'm going to do. This is episode number 499 of the Heart Centered Business Podcast, which means you can find all the relevant links and the show notes of today's episode over at tashcorbin.com/499. Here are 3 of the times that my ego got in the way. Let's do it. Hello, I'm Tash Corbin, a business strategist and mentor based on the Sunshine Coast in Australia. The mission of this podcast is to help heart-centered entrepreneurs to make more money, and in doing so, change the world for the better. This podcast was recorded on the lands of the Gubbi Gubbi and Jinnaburra people. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So as I said in the intro, I'm not sharing this as a particularly negative thing. I am not angry or frustrated with myself for doing these things. I don't think I'm particularly ego-driven, but in hindsight, I can definitely see that there was an ego-based sabotage going on where my ego wanted to protect itself. It wanted to protect me from embarrassment or failure or public embarrassment, public failure. And so it got in the way of me doing the things that actually would have driven results. So I'm not angry or frustrated at myself. I'm quite proud of myself for how far I've come in my business. I love me. I love all of me. I love my ego, right? It's not something that I would say is a negative thing that sabotages me all the time. As I said, I'm not particularly ego-driven either. But I do know that I have an ego. I do know that my ego can get in the way sometimes. I know that my ego is also responsible for times where I've set bigger goals or I've been more ambitious or I've strived for a higher standard when it comes to my photos or videography or something that I've created. Because of my ego, right? I totally understand and see where my ego has contributed positively as well. So I wanted to share that first because I do think sometimes, especially if you are raised as a woman, you're socialized that way, but also if you are from a marginalised community, we can tend to see the ego as very negative. We can tend to be trained or programmed or raised to see ego as only negative, and I don't feel that way at all. But I can absolutely see that in these 3 instances, and they've happened several times, they're not isolated, in these 3 examples, my ego has been a sabotage source. So I hope that in hearing my examples, you find that helpful for you in some way, whether it's identifying it in yourself, seeing where you may have labeled that as something else, or you may have labeled it as more helpful than it is. Let's see. Let's see if you find this particularly insightful. If nothing else, it's a lovely perv at the inside of my brain and at how my ego can get in the way sometimes. So let's have a play. Okay, so the first one is where I didn't want people to see me trying. I only wanted them to see me succeeding. Probably a very common experience, but also it's a huge sabotage, especially as a business owner. It was more prolific when I first started my business, and it was also more obvious when I first started my business. Things like asking a question on Facebook, and if I didn't have answers within the first 3 hours, if I didn't have a single comment within the first 3 hours, I'd delete the post. Now, I've since discovered that's really bad for your algorithm, so I wouldn't do that again. And now I still post on socials and sometimes don't get a single answer. And rather than seeing that as embarrassing, I just see that as an insight that there's something wrong with the way I've worded it, or I've asked it at the wrong time, or it's too hard for people to answer. Usually there's a reason that I can see as to why it hasn't got a lot of answers. But also in the early days of my business, of course it didn't get a lot of answers because I didn't have a lot of followers. I think I had like 102 followers. And if I didn't have an answer to a question within 3 hours, I'd delete the post. With only 102 followers, the chances that even a dozen people see it within the first 3 hours is pretty low, especially these days. And so rather than labeling that as, oh, that's embarrassing, I've asked a question and no one's answered, I'm looking at that as insightful. And if you refer back to last week's podcast episode, or the last episode of the podcast, 498, I talk about how I review my top performing and lowest performing posts on social media now on a yearly basis. I'm looking for themes and patterns and trends, not micro-analyzing individual posts. And so one of the things that I do is where I have had a question post perform particularly poorly, it's popped up in that bottom 3, I then look at, okay, well, why was that particular question one that didn't get any answers? In general, I will have at least one post a month where I ask a question and I get 0 answers. And so instead of avoiding that by asking less questions, I pay attention to the insights that I gain from asking that question and having a lower response rate. And so I shared in episode 498 that I review my top 10 posts per month and my bottom 3 posts per month, and I collect that to look for insights and data. I don't review it in detail on a month-by-month basis. I more look at it in my quarterly planning and then in a lot of depth in my yearly planning because I'm looking for patterns and trends. I'm not looking to micro-analyze every single individual post, but one of the patterns and trends that I definitely look out for is where I've asked a question and it's popped up in my bottom 3 posts. What was it about the way I worded it or when I asked it or how I asked it that may have made it more difficult for people to answer or that people felt less inclined to answer that question. So I only look at it in that sort of trending space rather than getting very attached to always having lots and lots of responses when I ask a question. And I did also see a bit of a similar pattern in relation to doing market research as well. So I was fine with doing market research in the first 6 months of my business because I felt like I was in startup. I was very open with people that I just started my business. I had executive coaching and business strategy experience from my job in consulting. And so I didn't feel like it made me less appealing as a business owner that I'd only been in business for a short amount of time. And so I was not particularly ego-driven in that space in the first 6 months of my business, definitely in the posts with no responses. That one I definitely felt really weird about. But the whole concept of doing market research just felt like it was a natural and very important thing for me to do in those early stages of my business. But interestingly, after having a 20K month in my 6th month in business, and I felt like, okay, I've made it now, my ego got in the way of me doing market research for quite a little while. I really am grateful that I noticed that and overcame it because I ended up doing market research interviews every single quarter in my business, at least every quarter in my business for the first maybe 3.5 years of my business. And then I dropped back to 6 monthly. And now I'm actually doing it even more often, like going back to the quarterly market research because it generates so many leads. It generates so much insight into how I can improve my messaging, into what people are focused on right now. It's so insightful for my business. But there was something going on in my ego that I felt this resistance to doing market research once I'd had a 5-figure month. Like there was something about that now meaning that I'd made it. So my ego was like, nope, I don't do market research anymore. I've made it. And so I'm glad that I noticed that one. But it was another example of not wanting people to see me try, only wanting people to see me succeed. And I think another example of that is in not asking for help or not even allowing people to see me trying something, and therefore proactively pushing help away, not even just not asking for it, but giving off the attitude or the feeling that not only am I not needing your help, but like, I don't even need to try at this. It just all works. And so that can come up in relation to asking my biz friends for support with helping to promote things. That can come up in people not sending referrals my way, people not sharing the podcast because I'm giving off this feeling that, oh, I've got it all nailed and I don't need anyone's help. And so I'm mindful to try and ensure that I'm not giving that off too much. Because whilst, yes, my business is far more successful these days, it's far easier these days, and, you know, I'm good, right? Things are going well. Every little bit of help is spectacular in its impact on my business. Every referral, every person who shares the podcast, every time someone tags me and thanks me for something, that makes a significant difference to the trajectory of my business. And why would I want to turn that away for the sake of giving off the impression that I don't need it and I don't appreciate it or I don't want it? That's so silly, but it is where my ego is getting involved, and it is an ego-based sabotage, therefore. So, I know that there were people who would have helped me so much more over the years if I had publicly tried instead of just sharing my successes. And so it definitely comes in phases and waves, and it shows up in different ways, but that's definitely the big one. Number one is where I don't want people to see me try to succeed. I just want people to see me succeed. I think that a lot of this has been healed by seeing other people that I admire being very open about trying things and wanting to succeed and the effort that they're putting in to their success. From Taylor Swift and the meticulous nature in which she plans and promotes things, and leans into support and getting help and, just being willing to be someone who tries and puts in effort and energy, to a podcast that I love listening to called Shameless. It's two Australian women who started it in their 20s. And they actually talk about this very openly, that one of the greatest things that you can do is publicly try and put in effort and, be unafraid to have people see you try and fail. And I love that. And then also all the way through to my people in my life, like my actual friends and business friends and family members. I've always kind of been that person who's unafraid to publicly give something a go outside of my business. I'm happy to be the weird, goofy dancer who looks like a baby giraffe just discovering its legs, right? I'm very tall. I'm 6'2". I've never looked like a very rhythmic, very in control of my body kind of dancer, but I enjoy the movement of dance. And so I'll be first up on the dance floor, dancing my goofy giraffe-like style at most parties. I love karaoke. I'm not a strong singer, but I love karaoke. I'm unafraid to give it a go and try things and ham it up and play and explore. But there was something about business that's brought this little kind of ego element forward. And so it's been really helpful for me to pay attention, to notice when it's there, and to remind myself that being someone who publicly tries things and puts in effort and does things for the sake of enjoyment rather than necessarily because there's a specific attachment to doing it perfectly or getting praise or getting results, I think that that's really powerful. And I remind myself consistently that I'd rather be that person than the person who is like caught up in the ego side and only ever gives off this air of everything's under control. I've got this. I don't even have to try because that's not who I am, and I certainly don't want to elicit that feeling in anyone else. The second way that my ego has sabotaged my business results is in wanting to be advanced before I streamlined the basics in my business. So I remember very vividly in my 7th and 8th month of business deciding that the only way for me to step forward and to grow my business was through passive and leveraged income. And that wasn't true. Not only was it not true, it actually created a huge drop in my results. And it also meant that I hadn't spent time finessing and streamlining the things that had got me to where I'd been, had got me to having a 20K month. The things that had got me to having people jump on a sales call and sign up for a $2,500 package then and there. Those things took practice and strategy, and yes, I got them working, but I was so keen and so ego-driven to be at the next stage of business that I didn't solidify those foundations underneath me. And I talk quite often about how a lot of the mistakes I made in my business, I don't regret. Like, I learned a lot from them. It's all good. But if there was one thing I could go back and change in the way that I grew my business, it would be to go back to myself in January of 2014 and say, spend a year solidifying exactly what you've created so far. Spend a year streamlining these basics and foundations. Get your emails out every single week without fail. Get a daily post on socials without fail. Get your feature content out every single week without fail. Get your lead generation strategies sorted and cemented and embedded as a ritual, as a practice. Even streamlining things like my follow-ups, my lead management system, all of those very basic, very important, critical foundations that just got completely abandoned and neglected as I pursued being an advanced business owner. And it did come from my ego. I didn't want to consider myself as still being in startup. I didn't want to consider myself as still getting the basics and foundations sorted. And it cost me hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars over the years, because the compound interest effect of not having that sorted was massive. It was absolutely massive. So when I first launched the Takeoff program, I went from mostly 5-figure months to having a $3,800 month in the month that I launched the Takeoff program. I made 13 sales. You know, I was very happy to at least have a leveraged income program, but I was unhappy with the results. I was led to believe I would make 50 to 100 sales and have a 50K month the first time I launched an online course, because that's what everyone was talking about on their webinars. And so to go from consistent 5-figure months to 3,800 the month I launched Takeoff, and then the following month I had an $800 month or a $900 month. It was under $1,000. And that was devastating. Not only was it devastating for my ego, which wanted to be advanced, but it was also devastating from a cash flow perspective. It put a lot of pressure on my business. It put a lot of pressure on me because by then we were down to my business income being our only income in our family, in our household. And so wanting to be advanced actually as an ego thing cost me so much growth and trajectory in my business results. And another example of that was I joined a $15,000 mastermind, but my business baseline income wasn't actually strong enough to cover the cost of implementing the strategies that were taught in that mastermind. So I joined that mastermind and I could pay for that mastermind. And that was a big ego thing of, look at me, I've got $15,000 to join this mastermind. But I didn't step back and assess, is this the right fit for the stage of business that I'm in? And is this actually going to generate growth for me? Do I have the resourcing to implement what I'm going to learn in this mastermind? And if I'd really stepped back and assessed that, the answer would have been no. Absolutely not. I didn't have the income level to invest $5,000 a month on Facebook ads, which was what was recommended in the first month of me joining the mastermind. I had spent every cent in my business bank account to join that mastermind. And so I didn't have the resourcing to do what I was being taught in the mastermind. But not only that, I hadn't been working with my VA for long enough to even be able to give my VA tasks that my mastermind facilitator was saying, I shouldn't be doing. My VA should be doing that. Give that to your VA. You shouldn't be doing that. You should be giving that to your VA. And so the mastermind was also built on this assumption that I'd have far more time to invest. I'd have the resourcing to free up the time and therefore have the time to implement the strategies. And I didn't have that. And so my ego being at the helm of making that decision to join the mastermind in the first place and wanting to be on par with all the other people in the mastermind really sabotaged my results that I could generate. And I wasn't alone, actually. I would say about half of the members of that mastermind weren't actually a good fit for it and weren't ready for that level of strategy. And we just wanted to be advanced, and our ego got involved in the buying process. I also think, yes, absolutely, that the person facilitating the mastermind should have been more upfront about what I would be told to invest and what resourcing I needed to be able to really generate results from being in the mastermind. But I also definitely take ownership for my ego being at the helm of that buying decision. And so, that desire to want to be advanced and my ego wanting me to be an advanced business owner as quickly as possible and wanting to jump up to the next type of strategy, the more advanced strategy, the more fancy strategy, the more involved strategy, that really cost me, because it wasn't just the $15,000 that I'd spent. It was the time going to those mastermind calls, learning those things, then trying to implement it, but being under-resourced in that implementation. And it was distracting me again from getting those foundations nailed, which if I had those foundations nailed, if I had a strong lead generation and lead management system, if I was really nailing my foundational content strategy before I joined the mastermind, I could have built on top of that. But I actually completely neglected that in order to do the mastermind things, and that therefore didn't work as effectively and didn't generate the results because it wasn't built on those solid foundations. So number 2 was about wanting to be advanced before I'd actually streamlined and systemized my basics and got those foundations nailed. And then the third time, my ego sabotaged my business results, and this has happened quite a bit over the last 13 or so years that I've had my business, has been getting loosey-goosey on my goals. So after I had a surgery in 2021 and I did not recover well, and I ended up needing 2 further surgeries, and I ended up 8 months out of my business or working less than 5 hours a week whilst trying to recover. I didn't know how long I'd be sick. And so I just got a bit loosey-goosey with my goals, because I felt like if I set a goal and I didn't achieve it, that would be damaging to my ego. So it was better to just not even set a goal in the first place. And I probably could have set lower goals and felt really good about that. And then they would have done a good job of keeping me focused and keeping me aligned with where I wanted to go. But rather than set a smaller goal, I just decided not to set a goal at all because ego. Right? Then the ego being battered over and over again as a result of that experience meant that I was far less willing to kind of even look at it or address it at the time. to give you a little bit of context, I was expecting to be in recovery for 6 weeks. I'd booked 12 weeks off. So I was expecting to have a further 6 weeks of just chilling out, maybe getting back into things a little bit slowly behind the scenes, but I didn't have any client-facing responsibilities for the 12 weeks. And so I thought I had given myself so much spaciousness, and I'd only really prepared to be away for 12 weeks. Even then, it was probably closer to 10 weeks because I fully expected to be up and running again pretty quickly. And so when I wasn't, and I ended up having 8 months of really, really limited capacity, the idea of setting a goal at any point in those 8 months just felt completely derailing to my ego. And it felt like such a shrinkage. And I didn't like the idea of shrinkage. Up until that point, my business really had done quite well at going from strength to strength, at consistently feeling like it was growing. I definitely had a few phases where things had shrunk down. For example, when I first launched the Takeoff program and having that shrinkage. And then again, I created a second passive income product called Pilot School. Rest in peace, Pilot School. It got canned very quickly after I launched it. And so I had a series of poor strategic decisions at that point in time that led to some shrinking of my income. I then recovered very quickly once I realized what had happened and went back into focusing on my foundations, focusing on selling VIP one-to-one, focusing on selling high ticket. I was able to recover that very quickly. So if you look at my financial year results year on year, they had increased year on year, most years. Some years had stagnated or gone down a teeny bit, but mostly it was improving year on year. So this was the first time where I'd had an extended stretch of shrinkage, and that really got my ego all feeling a bit yucky. And so I didn't necessarily stop setting goals at that point in time, but I stopped sharing those goals. I stopped getting attached to achieving those goals. I stopped getting excited about those goals. I instead just sort of threw them out, was very loose with them. If in the first few weeks it looked like that goal wasn't going to happen, I'd stop worrying about it. I wouldn't be looking at it. I definitely wouldn't share it. And so I just got really loosey-goosey about goals. And I've actually done a previous podcast episode on my initial resistance to setting financial goals and tracking my income in particular, and why I was in that resistance mode, all of the stuff that came up for me about that, and then what was the tipping point that actually allowed me to let that go and really sink into goal setting and tracking in particular. So I'll link to that in the show notes of today's episode at tashcorbin.com/499, because I think that will be a really helpful episode if you're feeling that way too. But I really do believe that that getting loosey-goosey on my goals, if I find myself doing that, it's an ego sabotage, is generally what's going on for me. And I can only speak about my own personal experience, but it's like I'd rather not even think about the goal or see the goal than go for it and fail miserably, than share it and then have to share that I didn't make it. And there are a couple of times where I did publicly really faceplant on it. There was one time I remember very specifically in Bali. So that would have been 2015, maybe early 2016. I think it was February 2016. I set a goal of having a 50K month. And my reward would be a trip to the Maldives, because I really wanted to go, and friends of ours had had their honeymoon there and it looked spectacular. I've always wanted to have the glass floor or the glass coffee table where you can see the fishies underneath, those types of things, and the swim up bungalow over the water. And I was not even really that close. I think I got to 32,000 or something. Luckily, I didn't make it because Davey had organised in secret for one of my best friends to come and stay with us in Bali for my birthday. And if we'd been in the Maldives, then they would have come and we wouldn't have been there. But I do remember feeling really embarrassed that I'd been so public about it. I'd shared so prolifically and I hadn't got there. And, a bit of an ego bruise in that one. And I do think that meant that from there, especially for the next year or two, I was far less likely to share my goals publicly, but also behind the scenes, I was just less likely to get excited about them. I was less likely to stretch myself. And this is why I think for all three of these, where I didn't want people to see me trying, I only wanted them to see me succeeding. I wanted to be advanced before I got my basics and foundations sorted and streamlined, and I got loosey-goosey around setting my goals and sharing my goals and going for goals and keeping them front of mind. In all three of those examples, I think this is why mindset is critical as business owners and why working with a mentor who doesn't shame you, who can help you get excited about those goals, but can also reflect back to you what they are seeing. I think it's so mission critical. And I think it makes such a difference to how quickly we do expand our business, how quickly we do expand our capacity to receive, how quickly we do end up achieving at those higher levels and really growing our business results significantly. I know for myself, when I've been working with a mindset practitioner consistently, my acceleration of my business results is measurable. And where I've had periods where I haven't necessarily worked with someone for an extended period of time or very consistently, the results haven't necessarily expanded as quickly. And there have been a number of reasons, maybe this is another ego sabotage. There have been a number of reasons why I've said I don't necessarily need to work with someone consistently, or I've decided not to work with someone consistently. And so I'd still say that most years I have at least 5 sessions with a mindset practitioner, even when I'm not working with someone consistently. But when I'm working with someone consistently, it's at least 2 sessions a month. Sometimes it's every single week. And the more I do that, the more I see a direct result from that, a direct result in terms of seeing the growth of my business results. It's sometimes a bit delayed. Like I know for the current work that I'm doing with a mindset practitioner, probably for the first 3 months, I didn't necessarily see a huge spike in my results. But from month 4 on, I can see the growth. I can see the growth. I can see the growth. And that's really powerful for me to be able to see that. And that's why I consistently talk about working with a mindset practitioner being part of the journey as a business owner, because we can sometimes be our own worst enemy. We can sometimes label something as a smart strategy decision, but actually it's our ego keeping us safe. So, for me, getting rid of posts where people haven't commented, you might think, well, that's a good strategy because then it looks like I've got really good engagement and people don't see that I've had dead posts. I definitely hear this from social media strategists and social media managers, that they are worried that their own socials having low engagement is a poor reflection on their strategic capability or their services. But I don't hire a social media manager or a social media advisor because their social media is amazing. I know that, mechanics have terrible cars. I know that, some of the most organized, amazing systems people in business have things that they let slide in their own personal life. I know that Even mindset practitioners, right? They don't always do their own mindset stuff consistently. So for a social media manager to have some posts with no engagement, I'm not worried about that. But I can see how people might convince themselves that that's a smart strategic decision to delete those posts or hide those posts from their feed. But I actually think it's the opposite. You're letting your ego dictate how you feel about your results and how you feel about your effort and your business. And instead of putting the time and energy and mindset capacity into that, I think that there's far more to be gained from just letting it be and from setting the ego decision-making aside. Same with wanting to be advanced. The idea of putting a course into your product suite feels like a really smart strategic decision. But if you do it too soon, I've seen it time and time again, you end up sabotaging your business results because you haven't got your foundations and your systems working like clockwork. You haven't got your basics streamlined. And I understand how much we want to see that growth and how much we want to be more advanced than we are. I totally get it. It's probably the most consistent resistance that people have to joining the Takeoff program, because I am very open about the fact that I only teach selling one-to-one packages and products. Like, that's all that we do inside Takeoff. It is foundations. I use those words very clearly. And so someone who's been in business for 5 years, but they're not making consistent income, they do need foundations, right? They do need to set up that baseline income. So I'm not going to sugarcoat that. But for a lot of people, their ego is the reason why they can't let themselves join. Because I don't want to be seen as someone in startup. I don't want to do a foundations program. I've been in business for years. I've done my foundations. If you had done your foundations and they were working really effectively, you would be making a consistent 5 to 8K every single month, especially if you get it nailed with your VIP one-to-one packages and getting those sold. Like, if you think about having even a $1,500 to $2,000 VIP package, if you had your foundational client attraction process working, you would be making a sale of that package at least once a week. That's $6,000 to $8,000 a month minimum income. One sale a week as a foundation, as a baseline. But there are so many people who do not have that foundation, who do not have that baseline in train. They don't have that nailed. They don't have it streamlined. And yet they are wanting to do advanced strategies like having tripwires and automated funnels and chatbots and all sorts of things. And they don't know how to sell their signature offer, their signature package. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why people convince themselves that that's not the smart strategy and that's not what they want to do and that's not their model moving forward. I totally understand that. And I would say that there are certain models of business or certain experiences or certain sometimes niches, sometimes marketing strategies. I totally understand. There are certain times where it just isn't the right fit, but I would say in 99% of cases where I have a conversation with someone, we talk about their capacity, we talk about the assets that they have in their business, we talk about what would be the fast track for them to get to that 5K month minimum baseline income. I would say 99% of the conversations I have, my recommendation as a strategist, and based on what I know about those people, based on asking a bunch of questions, really understanding their capacity, really understanding their personality type, really understanding their business niche, really understanding their messaging, still, for 99% of the people I talk to, learning how to get their foundation sorted, get that consistent VIP package sale coming in, setting a baseline income they can rely on would be the best thing that they could do. But I also know that for a lot of people, it is an ego-driven decision that has them saying, nope, I'm going to sell a $27 passive income product instead. And they would make far more money, far more quickly if they were able to let that go. Now, I'm not going to get into a big debate on this episode about all of that because I talk about it so consistently in other episodes. And I definitely want to say I understand as well. I have done it to myself as well. I wanted to be advanced before I had streamlined my basics. That was my ego sabotaging my business results. And as I said, I reckon it's cost me millions in sales, millions of dollars in sales. So of course, that's going to make me very passionate about helping you to avoid that same loss. Of course it is. And I hope that you take this like very emphatic conversation and very emphatic way of talking about it for what it is. And that is me wanting the best for you, me wanting you to have your most easeful, sustainable, most likely success as a business owner, because I know that when the people who listen to this podcast have economic power, have wealth, have success as business owners, everyone is going to be better off. The ripple effect when marginalized people, when women have money, have financial independence, have economic power is huge. It's the only time trickle-down effect actually works, is when the people who have the money are marginalized people. And so I absolutely share this, not because my ego wants to be right about your business. If doing it through a $27 passive income product was able to be as effective and fast and reliable as a strategy as doing it with the VIP one-to-one and getting the basics and getting the foundation sorted, I would absolutely be singing and shouting that from the rooftops. But in most cases, that's not what I see, and that is not my advice. As I've said on previous episodes, I can make any strategy work. So if you absolutely need for it to be the $27 passive income product, I absolutely have ways to help you to make that more effective and have ways that we can make that strategy work for sure. But it's often a longer road, or we have to invest more in advertising. It's going to cost you more in the short term. You need to be willing to make a pretty big financial loss in the early stages, or it's going to require a bigger investment in team straight out of the gate, particularly if you've got time limitation as one of the reasons why this is a strategy you want to pursue. But I even had a conversation with someone just a couple of weeks ago where she's working part-time. So she's working 2 or 3 days a week, and I thought she was working full-time. And so I said, well, actually a group program might be a better fit for you because you're working full-time and therefore capacity outside is going to be more limited. But because you're working, you're going to have that income source. So the pressure to have the financial return from the business is going to be lower, and you can take your time, right? So we might be longer getting to the 5K month baseline, but there's not so much rush because you've got that income from your job. And then when we actually had a conversation, she was like, no, I'm not working full-time. I'm only working part-time. And we talked through the different strategies and the different ways that she could be generating income. Again, we landed on actually selling a VIP package once a week and taking on no more than 6 VIP clients per month is a very doable strategy for you, far more likely to result in you making thousands of dollars a month rather than hundreds of dollars a month in sales early. And that's resourcing to be able to get you the team members you need, to be able to invest in advertising for those passive income products, for those group programs. So let's get you really well resourced here. Let's invest the next 6 to 12 months in getting those foundations sorted, getting those VIP packages selling, And then we can look at passive and leveraged income. And she was so on board with that because when we did the numbers, when we looked at the strategy, when we looked at the assets that were available, and when we looked at capacity to deliver, as well as capacity to market and do the marketing and sales activities, there was plenty there for us to focus on the one-to-one. Anyway, as I said, I don't want to get too much into that. I wanted to share with you where I can see that my ego got in the way of my business results, and they were my big three. I didn't want people to see me trying. I wanted to be advanced before I was ready to be advanced, and I got really loosey-goosey on my goals. So, for this episode of the podcast, I'd love to know, do you have any questions about this? Come on over to the show notes of today's episode at tashcorbin.com/499. And there you'll find some links to things I've referred to in this episode, but also a link for you to submit a question. And I am looking for lots and lots of questions because I'll be batch recording a bunch of podcast episodes in the new year. And I'd love to give you a shout out, to link back to you and to answer your question. So make sure you come on over, pop your question in using the form, and hopefully I'll be able to answer that in a podcast episode in the new year. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the Heart Centered Business Podcast. And until next time, I cannot wait to see you shine. Bye for now.